of making an assumption that you grew up in England. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. I was born in the UK.
Okay, yeah. So we've both had a Western education. We've both been through, the English education system. And I was brought up in Stafford, where we didn't have Punjabi class in those days. We still don't have Punjabi class. There's not enough of us to make that feasible. Where were you brought up, and did you have additional Punjabi classes in addition to your Western education?
Yeah, so I live and still do in Kent, where I was brought up. So more Medway towns. And when I look back now, actually, there were Punjabi classes, and my mum used to make me go, and it became a thing. So I'm fortunate that I had that experience. I can't say hand on heart that I continued that education, but some of it stuck.
Yeah, no, I had no Punjabi classes at all. And so the only information I had about Sikhi was from my family and from my local community, from relatives. And I remember it was probably when I was in secondary school when I made, because being an educator, I know that one of the ways that we learn at a very deep level is through making connections. And when I was in secondary school, I remember, and I was taught about Martin Luther and the Reformation. And I remember making a connection. Obviously, my teachers had no idea about Sikh history whatsoever. They didn't know anything other than what they were teaching us about, Western history, basically. But I made that connection from what I knew, like at a superficial level from my family, about Guru Nanak Ji's teachings. And then at school, I learned about Martin Luther and the Reformation. And when I learned about the difference between Catholicism and the Protestant movement, I thought, oh, that's similar to what Guru Nanak Ji did, because he was saying, we don't need to have an intermediary, like we don't need to have the priest to speak on our behalf. We can have a direct relationship with God. Do you remember when you made that connection? Can you remember connecting the dots between the ideology that Martin Luther was teaching and what Sikhi teaches? Do you remember that?
I think the only way I can remember that, it wasn't in school education. It was from my mum and dad used to go to spiritual gatherings for Radha Swami Satsang Vyas, which I used to sit there, and it was silence, and you were listening. I wasn't really listening at the time, but I made a conscious effort to come away with at least one word or one sentence from that information delivered, discourse it's called, which talked about different religions, and what they all meant fundamentally was for us to understand that it comes from within. So that understanding, I used to just question. So I'd learn a question or a comment and then ask back. So I think that's where my connections come from, because they were not only about Guru Granth Sahib, but it was other religions that were talked about and what the concept meant overall for humanity.
Yeah, and so yes, that's another way of making those connections, isn't it? Like comparing what we believe and how other religions have similar and different concepts. And what I found is that with the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, it's written in so many different languages. It incorporates Sanskrit and Arabic and Persian and some of the local Bhashas, I think Braj Bhasha and Gauravi and the local vernacular. And that for me was like symbolic of diversity, that when it's true diversity, we don't have to translate the other into our own form. We can allow the other to remain intact. That in itself is very powerful.
Yeah, and I agree totally with that, because what's fundamentally written can be understood and taken away from by anybody.
Mhm. Yes. And when we look at diversity now, you know, it's as though our gurus were like 500 years ahead, weren't they? You know, like we're talking about 500 years ago, they were not only advocating diversity, they, you know, it's manifest in the way they did things. I mean, the langar being one of them, like being able to eat together with on an equal basis with everyone, but this whole thing about allowing the different mother tongues and valuing each mother tongue, and at the same time creating the Gurmukhi script. So creating something innovative, but
Yeah.
use, you know, but not kind of transforming the other verses, the poetry. It can be so, as you said, it can be so lost in translation, can't it, when we try and adapt it to what the language that we speak.
Yeah, and I think that's what I have taken away all my life, really, is we can teach our mind that this is the way to behave. It's just making sure that it's a moral compass that you're going by, and that's what I've tried to. Does it fit? You know, what am I taking away and converting into what I understand from Sikhi? You know, does it fit morality wise, and does it fit with my inner compass to say, you know, are my behaviors justified because I'm interpreting something, or should I be actually, you know, just taking a step back and understanding that Sikhi to me means treating everyone with respect and having unconditional love for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you talk about the unconditional love, that reminds me of Pai Ganea. So again, it's like about making connections. And so unconditional love, altruism, you know, for me, those two concepts are interlinked. And Pai Ganea giving water, regardless of whether somebody was on his side or the other side, as it were. And that leading to, in my view, it's kind of like that concept is similar to the Red Cross concept, isn't it? You know, but
Yeah.
Red Cross didn't happen until a long time later. I mean, Bhai Ganea was doing that in Guru Gobind Singh Ji's time, which is that's kind of like would be between probably about 1700s. You know,
Right.
yeah, early 1700s. Whereas the Red Cross, I think that was inspired by somebody called Henry Dunant in 1863. The Red Cross was founded, I believe, 1863, from what I'm reading. So we're talking about at least 160 years earlier. Bhai Ganea was doing that. He was
Yeah.
actually demonstrating that, wasn't he?
And that's, you know, that's where I now am still learning how things are labeled down the line, but actually they've always been there in Gurmukhi and the teachings, but they necessarily haven't been labeled as, you know, this is a form of. And when you just talked about that there, I just thought of actually the charity, the volunteering, so that's instilled in us, you know, is something that feels normal to do.
Yes, this whole concept of seva. And I'm not sure, you know, I know in the Muslim religion, seva is very important as well, in the sense of
Yeah.
feeding the poor, you know, so, and then, so that kind of like takes us back 1500 years, you know, because, yeah, there is like this concept of giving part of our wealth to the needy. And Christ taught that as well, 2000 years ago, you know, like feeding the poor. So we're going back 2000 years and maybe even further back than that. And so it's as though a lot of religions advocate the importance of not only working for ourselves, but, you know, if we earn £1, give 10 pence of that to someone who is less fortunate, perhaps, you know.
Yeah, and that's what I took away subconsciously. I mean, during the lockdown, I made some huge changes to my lifestyle. You know, I had a diagnosis of borderline diabetes, so it became a thing that I needed to concentrate on my health. So then I started to take up some exercise. I've never run, never run before, didn't interest me, but then I thought, actually, if I don't change my ways, then my family are going to say, oh yeah, what's your history of, you know, diabetes, and they're going to have to say something there. So it felt almost like I needed to give them the opportunity to not have to say that, but also then it would benefit me. And then I made changes to being able to run, and then I ran for charity, because I felt, well, if I can do this, I can do it for some other cause as well. And it felt so good just to be able to give back.
It kind of empowers us, doesn't it?
Oh, there's no, I had a BBC interview actually around the Royal Volunteer Service that I basically, for my job, I was calling to check on the well-being, because I work for a financial institution. So during the lockdown, we were just checking that they were okay. And then I thought, well, I'm doing this full time. I can't do anything else for the community around us. You know, people are not only in the bank that need that help, there's people outside of that. So what can I do? And then by talking to colleagues, I found out about the Royal Voluntary Service and the check-in and chat. So then I thought, well, yes, I can do that of an evening. And it became a thing. And that gratitude, you know, somebody said to me during that interview was, you know, why do you do it? And, you know, how can you fit it in when you're working full time? But it's so rewarding. No, there's no words that you can say. And they were talking about putting a price on it. I can't remember the statistic now, but it was just announced at that time that the financial authority had said that it was about the worth of giving was about £1,500 as a pay rise in monetary terms. And when they questioned that to me, I said, well, I wouldn't put you know, any value on it whatsoever, but they've obviously worked that out. So yeah, there's nothing I would say that can relate to the reward that you personally get from doing something for somebody else.
Absolutely. So for thousands of years, so again, like maybe like we can't say, oh, Seva started with Sikhi. It started before. I think the Sufis were very much kind of they provided langar for people as well, you know. So and as I say, 2000 years ago, Christ, this is one of the things that Christ taught as well, about the importance of looking after the vulnerable, basically, and the needy. And during the lockdown, when I was watching TV and I saw these people doing charitable work, that inspired me to begin this project as well, the leadership project, because I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to go around handing out food to the homeless because I get cold. I don't like being cold. So what can I do? What can I do that is going to help others? And it's not meant for a, you know, there's no profit motive, and there's no, you know, it's meant for enhancement of our society rather than material gain for myself, you know. So the thing about doing seva and doing voluntary work, it can take lots of different forms. It can take the form of running for others, or feeding, or, you know, spending time with others, or simply using our skills in a way that we know it's going to add value.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think from the organisation's point of view that I work with, the employee-led networks is a within the organisation allowed me to join prayer through the Sikh network, which now I'm a committee member of. But you know, during the lockdown, not being able to go to the Gurdwara was something that was painful for everybody. But actually, God is within us. So I had to think of what else can I do. So by joining the network on a weekly basis, it gave me that spiritual well-being to continue that journey, and actually strengthened, you know, to bring back in line. I think I'd forgotten for a long time. Although I was going to the Gurdwara, I was doing the seva, the langar seva, you know, the community basis, not not having the ability to do that actually gave me more focus on what was actually being said in the Guru Granth Sahib.
Okay, brilliant. And so another aspect of our history, in school, we learned about the scientific revolution and, you know, the theories of Galileo. Galileo lived around about mid 1500s, you know, so I think he was born 1564 and he died in 1642. And that was the emergence of the scientific revolution. You know, Galileo was put under house arrest for daring to say that the earth was going around the sun rather than the other way around. And round about that same time, it was the period of the lives of Guru Amar Das, Guru Ram Das. So there in Punjab, we have, you know, the teachings of Guru Amar Das and Guru Ram Das. And there here in Europe, we have Galileo challenging the status quo, I suppose, and challenging. And so there's that thing about this, you know, of kind of going away from ritualistic superstition, isn't there, in both places? Yeah. So it's like, well, let's look for the truth rather than simply believe what others are telling us. And
yeah, and I think that's a huge part of growing up, you know, in the 80s in England, and being able to still relate back to your roots, you know, in some way, because those roots come from your parents, and those parents, my parents grew up in Punjab, and, you know, coming over and raising me, that sacrifice that, you know, I talk to them regularly. Sadly, my mum's passed away 7 years ago, but, you know, just understanding that sacrifice they made, and how those teachings going forward I can still implement and do something with them, you know.
Yeah, because it took a lot of courage for them to uproot and move to a totally new environment. And one of the reasons was for the education, wasn't it?
Yeah. And my mum was self-taught, you know, so she was one of four. She had four brothers, and there was one, just her. And I'm an only girl, and I've got a brother. But it was just independence all the way, you know, always try something. There was never a time that she wouldn't try something. And that sort of spurred me to say, okay. And then my mum learned how to write in English, how to speak the language, and then also learned Bhajan, so that she could do, you know, Kirtan in the Gurdwara, and Seva in Langar. So that then still instilled in me to continue, but maybe not, I'm not that creative yet. It might be something I take on later on musically, but it's something that I feel is the right thing to do in some way, not necessarily having to be at the Gurdwara to do it.
Yeah, but it's only recently that I've made the connection between the scientific revolution and Sikhi as well. You know, before this, I didn't, I kind of like knew that Sikhism was against kind of ritualism, basically, isn't it? You know, it's against kind of blind faith. Like when Guru Nanak Ji, he was, when he started trying to water his fields by splashing water in the direction of Punjab, and the priests were saying, why are you trying to splash water in that direction and not in the direction that they were doing it? He said, I'm watering my fields. And they said, but your fields are so many thousands of miles away. And he says, like, well, you're trying to feed your ancestors by splashing towards the sun, weren't they? And so that's kind of, you know, we have lots of examples like that, where the kind of blind kind of superstition is, you know, it's taken, it's like there's like a logical kind of analysis of it, isn't there?
Yeah, and that, I think, is that tradition, isn't it? Like, I never questioned mum's traditions. You know, things were done a certain way, they weren't questioned. But actually now I need to understand, you know, what's behind that, why are we doing this, and being able to think about it and understand from other people. Okay, so, you know, like I said, I'm learning all the time, and understanding another's perspective gives you that that foundation to see things from other points of view. But ultimately, I think that every religion is saying the same thing. It's just how we interpret it.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's through asking questions and challenging things. That's when we get to the core of, the essence of something that is the truth, rather than the illusion that's, wrapped around it.
Yeah, and it's understanding who you can approach. How can you get the information that it's not necessarily what you want to hear, but you need to be able to, sift out what's going back to that moral compass. Does it sit right?
Yeah. And then, we there's so much interest now on environmentalism, and our Guru Harai was advocating environmentalism back in the mid 17th century, wasn't he? So he lived from 1644 to 1661, and he was, so that's kind of 400 years ago again, almost 400 years ago, that he was an environmentalist, when it was, I think, at the same time that Guru Harai lived. That was the time when Newton lived as well. They were contemporaries, because Newton was born 1643 and he died in 1727. So we have Newton in Europe, who is advocating this kind of mechanistic kind of thinking, the mechanistic logic, as though everything can be understood like machines can be understood. And on the other hand, we have Guru Harai in Punjab advocating environmentalism and our relationship with nature. Here we've got two contemporaries, with two kind of contrasting ideologies, haven't we?
Yeah, but fundamentally, I've recently learned about Guru Harai Ji's teachings, and it's what we do now. We're 400 odd years late from when it was introduced, to actually think, if we don't care about our creation and live in harmony with nature, then it's the next generations that are going to suffer. And on the back of that, I've always been vegetarian because that's the way I was brought up. When people used to ask me, why are you vegetarian? Is it your religion? Was a question that automatically came out. And it was hard to find vegetarian dishes, in restaurants or in the shops. Reading each label to check whether it contained any type of egg or fish or meat. And then as time's gone on, where are we now? But some of our Sikhs, unfortunately, haven't adapted. We need to change, change for the environment, change for our health. These are the reasons to change, but they were taught so long ago.
That's right. And it's almost as though, like when I think about Newton and when I think about Guru Harai, it's as though we took the wrong path 400 years ago. We took the wrong path, because treating the world as though it was a machine has led to, I suppose it led to the Industrial Revolutions in a way that it kind of became out of control. When did the first Industrial Revolution start? So Newton was in the mid, we've just said, so the first Industrial Revolution with the steam engines, etc., was 1820. But that kind of arose through the teachings of Newton. It was like, but I mean, it's everything has a place. So it's not as though that mechanistic Newtonian thinking was wrong. It's just that it wasn't complete.
Yeah, and actually combining the two makes sense.
Yes, again, it goes to the synthesis, doesn't it? So if we synthesize this mechanistic thinking, like, well, machines, we're not going to get rid of the machines, but if we synthesize that with our ecological, environmental kind of relationships, then it can be more of an ethical approach to innovation, rather than simply kind of done with the profit motive.
And that's where you don't have to be one or the other. It's about combining the synthesis that you talk about. It's not a label that you've got to change X, Y, and Z and then that equals climate. you know, it's about our well-being, it's about our health, our environment. All of that has an impact on the climate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then we go to Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Now, Maharaja Ranjit Singh lived and he reigned for about roughly about 40 years. He reigned probably from about 1800 to 1839 for that 40-year period. And that was the period when this first industrial revolution kind of like really took off as well. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he embraced European, you know, there were Europeans in his army, there were Europeans in his court, and so that was the starting point of where I suppose Europe was getting, well, there was colonization, you know, that a lot of countries were getting colonized. That the colonization, that expansionist strategy, combined with the scientific inventions, that really made Britain very powerful, didn't it?
Yeah, and it comes back to, for me, we have got to adapt and change and accept, you know, everyone and everything has got to work together, you know, because fundamentally, why are we doing these things? You know, why are we generating the industrial side of things? Why are we earning money? Why are we bringing into climate? It's for a better living for all of us. You know, you know, the government talks about different things in terms of leveling up, that sort of thing. But I think we've been doing that on a smaller scale without anyone noticing.
And that's true. And up to now, up to until quite recently, it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seemed as though we valued Western education more than our own education, you know, until quite recently. Because even like during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, apparently there was about 80% literacy in Punjab. And when the British colonized, the literacy rate went, you know, rock bottom, because they changed the language in which we were taught as well. You know, they changed it to, they made Urdu the official language, and they tried to kind of, you know, ban Punjabi being taught. And so that kind of, it lowered the literacy level. So by the time the British left in 1947, the literacy level was very low, whereas in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, 100 years earlier, it was 80%. It was over 80% at that time. And so it seems as though we have been playing catch up and idolizing the Western form of education because we forgot our own roots.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, like I said, I'm learning so much now. And has it ever been highlighted that I was Sikh in the past? No, not really. I've gone through life, you know, accepting the people around me and still keeping that moral compass of my beliefs linked to, unconsciously linked to Gurmukhi. But at the same time, you know, wearing a turban, for instance, it's accepted now socially. Is it more acceptable and more understanding of, you know, bringing the best of yourself to your environment will give the employer more performance, because if you're yourself, then you're feeling more comfortable, then you're going to be more productive. So why that didn't appeal to me, or why I just wanted to fit in, because linking it back to sacrifice, parents made that sacrifice to come over. You know, they spent all those years sending money home, living in a country they didn't know the language, and adapting to that environment. And why would I want to rock that boat? You know, just keep it the same. But actually, if we don't change, this is my mindset now, if we don't talk about it and make that change and understand our roots, then you're not being able to educate yourself to understand why you're behaving that way, and, you know, and then sharing that for the next generation on the back of the Guru Haraji's Gurpurab yesterday, I wanted to do something for the environment. Just going back to your original, so I went back to the local Gurdwara, and I know them very well. And I went to see the teacher for Punjabi class. She does it on a Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for 2 hours. And the children were so open and absorbed to learn about Guru Har Ji. You know, it only took a few minutes. They read it, and then I asked for feedback. And the feedback has already started coming through that actually, yeah, I don't want to eat any meat anymore. You know, it's just so rewarding to understand that actually what I did, because I was grown up in that environment of not eating meat, if I don't explain that to somebody else, of there's a reason that that wasn't done, and there is a reason more so now than ever before, then no one else is going to understand they could change what they're doing.
Yeah, you know, it's like you've just reminded me that I became a vegetarian when I was 18 years old. The reason I became a vegetarian at the age of 18 is because I had been studying biology, and we learned about the food chain, and I learned about how much food was wasted if we ate meat, and if we used animals simply as machines to convert grass into meat and whatever. That's why I became vegetarian. But for so many decades, I have just simply been silent about my reasons for being a vegetarian. And I just think, because I haven't wanted to influence others. And it's like, why not? Why have I not wanted to influence others? Because I thought it was wrong to try and influence others. But when I look at the life of Guru Har Rai and all of our gurus, and what we've been taught for the last 500 years, we've been taught about vegetarianism for 500 years. And I don't think it's meant to be something that we need to keep silent about.
No, and it comes down to sharing. You know, everything that's in this book, in Guru Granth Sahib, is about sharing. And, you know, I think we do that unconsciously. You know, we share a bit of knowledge, we share a bit of happiness, and we try and share that we want to help somebody. But this is something we need to share, because if we don't share it, no one's going to know why the reasons are, or what good it can do to your health and your environment. And so, you know, I've got a family, they're grown up now, and I've just given them that feedback of, actually, when I was growing up, it was very difficult. Now you can go into a vegan restaurant, you can go into a vegetarian that caters for you. You know, being at celebration meals, it was like, what's on the menu for Bhinder today? Whereas now it's like, well, everyone wants a bit of whatever you're having. So it is about understanding the impact, and yes, celebrating that it's good to do these things for lots of different reasons, but let's talk about them.
And the thing is, you see, that our gurus, they've been teaching us this like for the last 500 years, and so many of our Sikh ancestors over the last 500 years have given their lives up. You know, they've given up their lives for us to follow this pathway. And it seems a shame to not acknowledge the sacrifices they have made in trying to win the right to be able to follow the Sikhi way of life, basically, and which includes being vegetarian, which includes, you know, the right to wear the star, the bag, the turban. You know, it includes all of those things. And so people have actually given up their lives for this, haven't they? You know,
yeah. And that sacrifice that I talked about, parents, you know, that sacrifice has always been there from day one of Guru Granth Sahib and the teachings. But it's us recognizing it. However, it's also about, you know, we can still change. It's not saying that's it, you know, you've missed that opportunity. It's about saying, okay, well, if we talk about it in a language that suits that person, whether they're young or older. You know, I think previously for myself, it was difficult to understand what was being read in the Shabds and the Guru Granth Sahib and other religions. But then when it's broken down or given to you in writing in English, or, you know, so it's adapted to something that you can learn about, or you can change. You know, I although I learned Punjabi in Punjabi school, I can just about put some letters together to make out what that word says. Well, I can speak it well. So it's just understanding there's so many different ways you can learn if you want to. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason not to learn.
Yes. Yeah. And again, it's like what it is that we're exposed to. Because I remember as a young adult, I was influenced by Marxism. I was influenced by, I've not actually read Das Kapital. I've not yet read it because I think it's a very difficult book to read and like really understand. But I used to have the nickname Das Kapital when I was at university. That was and then we have people like Bhagat Singh, you know, the martyr, Bhagat Singh. And I believe, I only learned this recently, I believe that he was very much influenced by Marxism, because he wrote, when he was in prison, he wrote a book called Why I Am an Atheist. And when he wrote Why I Am an Atheist, you know, I've read that book. It's kind of quite a short book that he wrote. It's more like a long essay. And he seems to be very much influenced by the ideas of Marxism. And that kind of makes me think, well, what kind of schooling did he have in that time? The education he had was a Western education, because that's what was available at that time. And so teachings from our gurus he might not have had as much access perhaps to those, you know, so that's why he was more, you know, he was obviously, he believed in egalitarianism, he believed in freedom, but he latched on to the ideas of Marxism as opposed to the ideas in Sikhi.
Yeah, and it could have been that he didn't have the capacity to build that knowledge. Like you say, it's your environment. So, but it's good to take influence from your environment. You know, we have our work environments, we have our living environments, and no matter where you are in the world, but you have now the opportunity to use technology and understand what you want to understand, you know, in a good way, so that you can investigate. Whereas before it was such a hard thing to do, to just first you have to go to a library. If you can't find the book, then you have to order it. You know, all of that is now at your fingertips. And taking influence from your environment is certainly a good thing, but it's also understanding what sits right with you.
And I suppose having the internet and having access to the internet and ideas from all over, that's what's allowing us to join the dots, whereas before it wasn't so easy for us to join the dots. I mean, for example, I didn't even know that in the suffragette movement, I didn't know that Dalip Singh's daughter was part of that suffragette movement. Sophia Dalip Singh, Sophia was one of the suffragettes, and I had, you know, growing up, I had no idea that Sikh, you know, that someone descended from Sikh royalty, basically. Well, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, she was his granddaughter. I didn't make that connection.
Yeah. And I think that's where, you know, there's so many things that we can still learn. You know, we have our gurus, but we also have their families and the influences of the females in those families we can learn about, because, you know, every family has a female that's going to influence the male, and learning about that they're labels, aren't they? So we can learn about the females, we can learn about the males, we can learn about the environment, but they're already there. It's just that we need to go back and look at them.
Yeah, and I think when we start to join the dots between different bits of information we know from different contexts, it's when we join the dots, then that wisdom kind of emerges, that there's more, we're creating a container for more wisdom to emerge, I suppose, right?
Absolutely, for the next generations as well. You know, it's so, like I said, it's so rewarding when you're giving, but it's also rewarding for yourself to know why am I doing something, or what can I learn from that experience, and then sharing that. And you know, the sponges that are out there, you know, they're ready to learn. What can they do to make things better for themselves in the future? It's just making sure that we deliver it in the right way, because dictating is not going to achieve anything. You know, I think when in the past it's been, right, you've got to go to the Gurdwara, regardless if you're learning anything, you go to that Gurdwara, you go and sit down for 2 hours, you might not learn anything from that environment. So that can become a resentment, you know, it can become an opposite effect.
Well, the thing is, you see, what I notice is that in some gurdwaras, when they do Punjabi classes, it's as bad as the English teachers not knowing anything about our history. It's the other, you know, the contrast is that we have Punjabi teachers who don't know anything about the English history, and that can be just as problematic because they're teaching without making connections with what our experience is.
Yeah, and I learn from experience. You know, if someone gives me a textbook, I will read it, but I don't necessarily understand it fully to then implement it. Whereas if I'm doing something practical and it relates to, and then I'm learning a bit more, then it's more satisfying as well, isn't it?
It's that educational thing of like making what we're teaching relevant to the learner. Unless it's relevant, unless it's appropriate, unless it's, you know, you're building on to what they already know, it will seem as though it's kind of disintegrated, totally disintegrated from our experience, and therefore we will never remember it. You know, I've probably been taught lots of things about Sikhi which I just don't remember because they didn't connect with anything that I knew.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I think. We've got a chance now to all learn from each other, but share that. You know, it's so important to share it. And now we can put a reason behind it and they can investigate for themselves. You know, is that okay? So we can only guide each other. At the end of the day, children, when we're bringing children up, we can guide them down a certain path, but ultimately it's their decision in life how they take that and what they learn from it. And so being able to do that for ourselves will then emanate a different environment for the positive.
Yeah, because there's so much kind of focus now on the environment, for example, in terms of the ecological environment. And for some people, they can say, oh, it's just a fad. People will kind of, you know, keep talking about this for a few years and then we'll forget about it. And then if we draw back to the teachings of Guru Haraj, you know, we look back and we say, no, this isn't a fad. This is like very deep philosophy, and it's kind of tried and tested. You know, it's lasted like for all these hundreds of years. It's not just a fad. It's you know, we need to start taking it seriously as it deserves.
Absolutely. And that's where behaviors come into it, doesn't it? It's not a textbook, right? This is what you've got to do. It's about, okay, understanding the root of what's being explained. And climate has always been there. Climate is, you know, what we're living through and will continue to do so, but it's how we look after it. You know, it's like a plant pot. If you take a plant home, unless you nurture that plant and look after it, or understand from somebody else, Google it, or whatever you've got to do the research of how am I going to make this plant to, you know, continue living and make the best of it. And so, yeah, I just think we can make a difference, but we've also got to be able to, sorry, I've lost my train of thought then.
What I thought of when you were talking, what I thought of is like, it's as though like we have spent so many years of our lives trying to educate ourselves, and yet the education that we've been striving for was already there. And, you know,
and that's what, you know, in my work life, I'm not a leader. I'm not there. All my banking years, I haven't made that step. And people ask me, why haven't you made that step? And I'm thinking, I don't know why. It could be that, you know, I didn't find anyone else that looked like me that could encourage me to do that. It could be just self-confidence. I don't like interviews. I've just done a couple of interviews. Now I'm learning that actually I can interview. So it's coming out of your comfort zone, certainly. Coming out of your comfort zone.
Mm. Okay, brilliant. Well, Bhinder, I've loved this conversation with you. I found it really inspirational. So thank you very much for making all
No, thank you.
relevant connections. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Take care.
You too.